The next point of discussion is warfare. Romans 13 grants the government the right and responsibility to bear the sword. This is done both internally to protect our citizens and externally to protect us from other countries. The Lutheran confessions teach that Christians may engage in just wars. Thus, this raises the question as to what is a just war. Well, first and foremost, Romans 13 declares that governments are to use the sword to curb wickedness and to protect the innocent. Thus, a war should be declared not for the sake of mere territorial or financial gain, but to defeat evildoers and to defend the innocent. In Luther's writings, he also establishes several other principles for the making of a just war. Luther also divides wars into three categories. There are inferiors versus superiors, wars amongst equals, and superiors versus inferiors. Regarding the first situation of inferiors fighting against superiors, that is, when a small nation fights against a much larger nation, Luther held that this is never a just war. Luther taught that a just war is one that needs to be able to be won. A suicidal assault from a smaller nation against a much larger nation, which will only result in the death of many, many citizens and never result in victory, is not a just war. Obviously, little nations should not go picking fights with more powerful nations. But Luther said even if the larger nation started the fight, then the smaller nation should seek to sue for peace and preserve the lives of its citizens rather than fight a war that cannot be won. Luther held that Christians in this situation need to be able to bear the cross and to pray to God, waiting for God to bring justice. If possible, then they should flee, for Christians are instructed to flee from such persecution. Presumably, smaller nations can make pleas to larger nations for assistance, but as Luther taught, if the war cannot be won, then the government has the responsibility to surrender and to preserve as many lives as possible rather than to waste lives for an impossible victory. Now, regarding war amongst equals, in which victory is possible, Luther established several principles for a just war. Firstly, Luther draws a distinction between wars of desire and wars of necessity. The former he calls of the devil. Wars should not be fought for territorial or financial gain, or for glory or for revenge. Luther considered war as a necessary evil. He states that in order for one to go to war, they should first think, I love my neighbor and would prefer not to fight them, but for the sake of necessity, I am compelled to have to fight them. Next, Luther teaches that war should only be fought for the preservation of peace, to protect the innocent and to defeat evil. Therefore, a war should either be fought out of self-defense or because it is necessary to invade to prevent a greater evil from occurring. Concerning self-defense, Luther wrote regarding the Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, that if times were different, he would rather prefer to leave them alone. Luther desired a policy of, you leave us alone and we'll leave you alone. However, since the Turks kept attacking Europe, then the Europeans had no option but to fight back and to invade the Ottoman Empire. Concerning the prevention of a greater evil, Luther wrote that the government wielded the sword to curb wickedness. Therefore, one must ask himself, is it profitable to suffer a small lack of peace now in order to avoid a greater lack of peace in the future? We can also add to this list the curbing of wicked leaders or regimes. The government is to wield the sword to curb wickedness. Therefore, if we know that another nation is committing great acts of evil, then governments may engage in warfare to keep evil out of their country, or they may invade other countries to prevent evil from happening there. For example, consider the Spanish conquests of South America, in which they were done in the name of eradicating the pagan practice of human sacrifice. Now, regarding wars between superiors and inferiors, Luther held that stronger powers should not use their might to oppress weaker nations. Luther taught that a superior should only invade an inferior if necessary. For example, if a smaller nation is stirring up trouble and needs to be put down quickly before things get out of hand. Essentially, stronger nations need to protect weaker nations, and they should only serve as peacekeepers. Lastly, Luther addresses the issue of soldiers fighting in wars that might be unjust. Here, Luther states that you need to do what is right within your vocation. Therefore, do not do something that is sinful as a soldier. However, regarding whether the war was just or unjust, that responsibility falls not on the individual soldiers, but on the leaders who are declaring the wars. It may be unjust for this nation to invade that nation, but a soldier, it is simply your duty to do what you're commanded to do. If the war was unjust, then you should leave it to God to bring about true justice. Now, as Willard Albeck wrote in his studies in the Lutheran Confessions, every government asserts that it acts and its policies are lawful and just. The individual Christian rarely is in a position to have all the facts. And when his nation is at war, his judgment is biased. The brutal fact is that the Christian citizen must conform to laws which provide at best only a rough justice. The reality is that in some cases, neither side is actually just. And in some cases, maybe both sides are justified in the war. It would be great if people could just sit down and work things out peaceably. But this sadly is not the reality of this fallen world. And as a soldier, you simply follow your orders and pray to God that you are on the right side. With that said, Luther does also teach that the government does not have jurisdiction over soul and conscience. And the confessions do teach us to serve insofar as we can do so without sinning. Thus, if one truly thinks that their government is doing something wicked and that the war that they are engaged in is not justifiable, then we must obey God rather than man, and we need to object.